In this chapter, up till now, we have dealt with loops that had a finite number of iterations. There were always conditions that ended the loops. So like, for example, in a for loop, in a for loop, we had some sort of I is less than to some extent, for pretend example. But what if we didn't want to include such conditions, or if we had a condition that never changed? Well, in that case, we would have an infinite loop. So in JavaScript, when we have an infinite loop that doesn't stop, we actually crash the system. We crash the browser. So let's imagine we have a sort of message system, and a while loop kind of represents the connection. And every time the connection is alive, since the connection is alive all the time, so true, we're going to increase the value of the messages sent. So plus equals 1. So notice here in the condition of the while loop, I used true. And that means the condition is always true and it never stops. So if I run my web page, so I'm going to open my web browser, I'm going to refresh. Actually, I didn't save it. That's from before I was testing something. So I saved it. And I run it again. You notice how the browser crashes, freezes, because, well, the loop goes on forever and ever, and it leads to infinite amount of operations, which basically overloads the browser, and it crashes. So this is an infinite loop. And so typically, in an infinite loop, we have a condition that doesn't change, or it happens to always be true. So like this, true is always true. Well, actually, if it doesn't change, then the condition is always true. So yeah, here I just put true. You could put any constant value. I often just put true or 1. And the same thing goes for an infinite for loop. So we have a for loop. However, in a for loop, we don't necessarily have to add the true like that. If we want an infinite for loop, we just remove the condition. So that's like we have a constant condition or a lack of condition altogether. And this would result in the same thing, basically crashing of the browser. So let's see that. We're going to refresh it. And there you go. See, it freezes, nothing's happening. And it's just going to tell me to stop the script. It even tells me where it is. So at line 7, right here in the loop, it stops. It keeps going on forever. Message keeps going on to infinity. All right, so how would we stop an infinite loop? So in our situation with the messages, we want to stop after a certain number of messages, but while keeping the line open. So we would have some sort of condition where we see this, where we want to stop. So if message equals 14, we want to stop the loop. Console log, we're going to say stopped at, and we're just going to say plus message. So we're saying including the number from message into the string, which is going to be 14. And here we're going to use a familiar keyword, break. Break is used in loops to stop the loop from iterating, to exit the loop. And this is particularly handy in infinite loops. So this is like saying, in a way, that we want to keep while message is not 14, we want to do some work. We want to increase message. So let's see how that would work. So actually, let's run this and show you that it doesn't crash the browser anymore. So doing this is like having this condition. So we have message unequal to 14. And we're going to erase this. We're going to have this at the end, actually, after the loop. So the loop is going to break on its own. There you go, same result. So it's basically like manually putting in our conditions. Why would you use this? You might ask yourself, you might be asking me, actually. So you might be asking this, well, in some situations, you might need to have of infinite loop that constantly runs. And this can sometimes actually be faster because you don't have to keep checking the condition. You just keep running the code inside, and in each iteration, you'll have the condition checked anyway. So this might run faster because you don't have to check the condition beforehand, before running the code. Or you might have an application where you require a constant loop, for example, in a communication channel to keep the communication alive until a certain condition is met, and then afterwards you break the connection, for example. That's why I use that in this sort of analogy of a message system in a constant connection, the while true connection. The messages are constantly sent back and forth, so you constantly have one message added to the message variable that indicates the message being sent. And yeah, and we have one message equals 14, it stops. So that's what I'm doing here. It's just figuratively. This just represents the operations that I just described, not the operations themselves. Excuse me. So we can actually do the same with the for loop. So let's write that out. For, we're gonna just delete our condition, that meaning that it's always iterating. And we're just gonna take this code right here and bring it over here. The only difference is the for loop, like I said on the tutorial on for loops, is that we know the variable I in advance, and we know we're iterating it in advance instead of iterating it within the code. But it didn't iterate before at all because it was a continuous loop. Here we're actually iterating through a value, but we don't have a stopping condition. So yeah, by break, we are using if condition plus break in a infinite loop. We sort of make our own we make a more detailed condition where you might have a faster iterating loop. All right, so I think that's it on break for now. That's it for break. Now let's move on. So we covered infinite loops and we covered break. So we have another keyword that often is paired with break, well, not together in functional purposes, but they're often compared to each other. We have continue. So what continue is, this is a keyword, a reserved keyword in a reserved word in JavaScript, so we can't use this for any variable names or anything like that. Continue means that we're going to skip an iteration within a loop. So it's going to be a similar formula. So let's have a for loop that goes, up to, I don't know, let's go up to 100. And inside this loop, we're going to have an if condition. So the formula for break and continue is we often have an if condition that encompasses the break statement or continue statement, because we want to have a condition. Based on a condition, we want to stop iterating there, or stop iterating altogether, escape the loop, or in the continuous case, we want to just skip over an iteration. So let's say we want to display all odd numbers between 0 and 100. We're just going to say if I remainder 2 equals 0, that means if it's even, we want to say continue. Whoops. Otherwise, we're going to say console. And let's be more creative. Let's have a sum for sum equals 0. And we're going to have sum equals plus equals I. And notice here I'm not using an else statement because, well, you don't necessarily need an else statement. You can just have one if it checks the condition, it just continues through the iteration and it just keeps going, because this will be encountered anyway in the next iteration. So you don't need an else statement here, but you could do it for safe measure. So let's do this. Let's keep going. So we're going to have, at the end, we're going to say console, the sum of all odd numbers from 1 to 100 is, and we're just going to concatenate sum. There we go. And you get 2,500. So a word of advice here with continue. I was actually testing how to use continue with a while loop, and apparently it wasn't working properly. So you might want to test that, check for yourselves. But when I was testing it, I was using a while loop for this sort of situation instead, and it wasn't working. It just kept going on forever. Maybe I forgot something, but just letting you know. So to recap, I often use, you're always going to use continue and break inside if conditions, and I often use continue inside for loops, because in while loops, you're checking the condition beforehand. If you're checking a condition within a condition, you have a constant condition already on top of things. You might get a little confused, and you might end up looping infinitely at some point. So this is just a warning. You might want to test using while loops. So actually, we might even test that here. So let's do that. So let's do while. We're going to do I is less than or equal to 50. Actually, let's use j this time. J. We're going to say j equals 0. And we're going to have a semicolon. And inside here, we're going to have, let's have another sum. Let's have var sum2 0. And sum2 is going to have it's going to have j added to it each time. Then we're going to iterate j, we're going to increase it. But before doing all that, we got to check if j is even, we are going to continue. So you're going to skip over that iteration and just go to the next one and do this operation. So let's run that. So we're going to save, and we're going to see if that works. And see here, this is what I was talking about. For some reason in JavaScript, I don't know why, when we use a while loop and we want to use continue, it just doesn't work. But in other programming languages, it should work. So you should just be careful when using continue. And from this, we can say it just works with for loops. So I think with that, I will conclude this tutorial.